We good? Okay. Good morning, everyone, and to all participants joining us today, both online and in person at the World Trade Organization, the WTO in Geneva. It's really my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today's panel titled Impact Assessment of Gender Provisions in Free Trade Agreements, an Empirical Look at the African Experience. Now, my name is Nadira Bayat. I'm the Economic Affairs Officer with UNCTAD's Trade, Gender and Development Program, and I'm delighted to serve as your moderator for this event. Now, today's discussion is taking place in a world characterized by fragility while grappling with the dramatic socioeconomic effects of a pandemic that has far-reaching and disproportionate consequences on the most disadvantaged groups, and this includes women and girls. Indeed, the pandemic has laid bare the pervasive and increasing gender inequalities in economic opportunities, including across sub-Saharan Africa. Now, we know that there are an increasing number of regional trade agreements that include provisions that explicitly promote gender equality and support women's economic empowerment. But really, have we stopped to question and interrogate what are the concrete impact of those provisions for women? Now, we also know that there are challenges to assess the contribution of gender provisions on gender equality and the participation of women in the economy, but we also have some evidence at the same time that demonstrates a positive correlation between the implementation of gender provisions and the increase of women's participation in politics and decision-making roles in Africa. So today's panel is timely and it is incredibly vital because today we are going to explore the link between the implementation of gender provisions in regional trade agreements and the increase of women's participation in politics and decision-making in Africa. And of course, this is part of a larger imperative to empower women as a fundamental for accelerating the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals and the African Union's Agenda 2063, and particularly in the aftermath of COVID-19. Now, leading us into this incredibly important discussion is my sterling panel, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Danielle Ndela, who will be joining us online. Danielle is the trade expert of the Regional Economic Communities in Africa, and he's also the managing director of Zim Consult. I'm also very pleased to introduce Amrita Bahri, WTO Chair, Mexico, ETAM, Anoush de Berossian, Head of Trade and Gender Unit at the WTO, and Lolita Lepere-Forget, Trade and Gender Officer at the WTO. So ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, let us begin. I'd like to remind you that we have interpretation services provided in English, French, and Spanish. So it gives me great pleasure to call on Mr. Ndlela from Zim Consult to deliver the keynote address. Mr. Ndlela is joining us online, as I said. Mr. Ndlela, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for this session, and I'm also happy that I'm able to join you from this side of the Southern Hemisphere. We are talking here about gender provisions in the treaties of the South African region, and I will really concentrate on PTA for Eastern Southern Africa, which was started in 1981 and concentrated on government cooperation, going into COMESA, established 1994. The COMESA, in essence, recognized Women in Development and Business Unit as it was established within the treaty itself. But in essence, things have not gone that fast and well. It recognized that women constituted about 50% of the population, 70% of agricultural produce were dominantly done by women in communities and so on. Eventually, the COMESA established certain forms, like the National Association of Business Women in member states were established, the Federation of National Association of Women were established, And more recently, COMESA established a Federation of National Association of Women in Business. And this was established because it is actually involved in the treaty. With a little background, I actually worked for the ECA at the time when I was regional economic advisor on regional cooperation. At the time, after I left ECA, I worked with COMESA in a lot of ways, like really participating in drafting the treaty. The earlier treaty did not have women in business, no matter they were beginning to practice it. But the later treaty then established this facility of actually having a chapter of women in the treaty. What was the purpose of the chapter? To facilitate the creation of forums for influencing dialogue on policy decisions, formulation, as well as lobbying governments to adopt gender-sensitive policies. Establishment of focal points, such as business centers, sorting out of business information and dissemination, promotion of entrepreneurial skills and development of management technical and technological skills, promotion of micro enterprises, and the establishment of a revolving fund which was supposed to facilitate access to credit to women. I must hasten to say that as observers in the COMESA region, this thing has not been done really at the regional level. No matter at the country level, some countries are having some funds for assisting women in many ways and so on. These were the issues that were actually developed during this particular period in the COMESA region. What is more important here, particularly for regional economic communities, is that the COMESA Federation of National Associations of Women in Development recognize the importance of women as a vital economic link within the chain of agriculture, industry, trade, and so on. This, by the way, is not only in COMESA. I worked for many years with the West African Union, the big one, the ECOWAS. At the same time, they really have the similar facilities in the treaties, but in practice, you wonder actually if it is being implemented in essence. This facility of the link was to increase the awareness of women in business issues and policy level, to create an enabling environment for effective participation in women in the common market, trade and development activities, promote special programs for women in small and medium-sized enterprises. There are many other issues that have been tabulated, but I'm just mentioning a few of them. The next one could be to eliminate such laws and regulations that hinder women's access to credit. You know that traditionally the nations have had a situation where women were not really favored in the credit, employment, and so on business. But then there is this law which was to facilitate regulations that would stop hindering women's access to credit. Finally, this facility recognizes and supports the Federation of National Associations of Women in Business established to promote the effective participation of women in the common market. No matter, I'm not an expert in the gender issues, but I have observed during all this process of drafting the treaties when I was working for the ECA in Addis Ababa, and they're working also for COMESA, SADC, ECOWAS especially, notice that, yes, there is a situation where women are already there in the treaties, but in practice, there's still a lot to be done by both regional economic entities, what we call RECs, regional economic organizations, and then the nations themselves, because the whole thing must start at the national level for it to be successful. That's quite important. We mentioned also the fact that by 2019, the AU strategy on gender and equality on women's empowerment was launched during the AU summit of February 2019. This is a way, in this way, this is something which is quite progressive. I think these are the highlights I can actually come in during the discussion. Thank you very much, facilitator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ndlela. That's incredibly important. Your rich and keen insights have really highlighted the importance and the inclusion in regional trade agreements, specifically in COMESA and ECOWAS, of those targeted interventions to empower women, including access to finance and skills development and education and training, which I'm sure we will unpack during the discussion. We're now going to launch into our interactive question and answer session with our panelists. And I'm going to now turn to my first panelist, Lolita. So beginning with you, Lolita, can you provide us with a brief background and just some context and explain to us what is the nature of women's participation in politics and decision-making roles in Africa? Over to you, Lolita.
Yes, thank you very much. So actually, in Africa, women are leaders. They occupy various leadership positions and decision-making roles, either in the private sector or in the public sectors. Although the figures are higher than the global average, it's still not gender balanced. If we just have a look at the private sectors, for instance, so we can see that there's so many studies that try to draw the picture of the representation of women in decision making in the private sector, and one of them is the Grant Thornton in 2021, who estimated that women represent 39% of the senior management position in the private sectors. So, and this figure is actually way higher than the global average. Still not gender balanced, but you can see that women are quite well represented. If we have a look at the representation of women in company boards, women represent in Africa 25% of the seat holders, and 25%, so almost a quarter, they chair the boards. And McKinsey actually estimated that women as a CEO represent only 5%. So there's still a lot to do, but when we have a look at the global average, the global pictures, the figures are a bit more positive in Africa. But when we turn at the, when we have a look at the private sector, the public sectors, the figures are more encouraging, and especially in East Africa. And for example, at the continental level in Africa, women represent about 25% of the parliamentary seats. But in East Africa, in particularly, they represent more than 30%. So we can see that it's quite positive, and as well as in Rwanda, in particularly, actually, because it ranked the first globally with 61% of women. Also in the East African community, so there are 6 members, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Burundi, and South Sudan. They all ranked quite well on the global ranking. Rwanda ranked 6th. With 55% of women in the ministerial positions. So this is quite very positive figures. Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, and South Sudan all ranked between 30% to 37%, and Tanzania ranked close to 20%. So we can see that the representation of women in decision-making roles in Africa is not yet gender balanced, so it's not so, except some exception as in Rwanda. We're not there at the 50%, although the participation of women is still quite significant. We can see also that the studies demonstrated the increase over the years, the gradual increase of the representation of women in decision-making roles and leadership position, both in the private and public sectors. But this is not a coincidence. Governments have put in place measures, they have taken actions and commitment in legal binding or legal instruments, I should say, to promote the participation of women in decision-making. And this is precisely what we're going to discuss today.
Thank you so much, Lolita. And, you know, it's a mixed picture, I think, that we're seeing. You know, we see that women in decision-making roles in Africa, the figures tell us it's not gender balanced. Significant progress has been made, particularly in East Africa and the public sector, but still a long way to go. And you know, we see that change can only happen through deliberate and targeted efforts, through policies, through gender-responsive policies, and other targeted complementary measures and programs. I'd like to now zero in onto something more specific. And here I'd like to hear both from you, Amrita, and from Anush. So really, we need to be able to understand what are gender provisions in regional trade agreements meant to achieve? And maybe here, Amrita, I'll start with you and then over to you, Anush.
Thank you so much, Nadira. So that's an interesting question. And I think we can probably answer it in two different points. So what can they achieve? And what do they say they want to achieve, right? So allow me to go back to my first question. What can they really achieve? They're all aimed at reducing barriers that women face, right? So here, the key is to create a level playing field, to basically equalize the platform of opportunities, of market access, of access to productive resources, of access to education for men and women, both. It's not to transfer the opportunities from one to the other. It's to create a level playing field. That's plain and simple, and we understand that. But what can they really achieve is the real question, right? Because most of these provisions that we find in the existing trade agreements, and that is what, you know, we always go back to as trade and gender enthusiasts, are best endeavor promises. Most of the provisions on gender, on women empowerment, on gender equality in the existing trade agreements are framed as promises, often not accompanied by provisions on enforcement, on monitoring, on review, on implementation. So I fail to understand how, without any anticipation or any movement or effort towards implementation or enforcement, whether these provisions would ever be put into action. But I guess we have found an evidence to it. We have found an evidence to it that we are going to cover and explain in the study that we are working on. And now let me move to the second point. What do they say they want to achieve in these agreements, right? There are multiple promises we find in the existing agreements in the continent and across the globe. So going global here and broadly speaking, there are different things that different regions have sought to achieve from these agreements. Very different things. There are some regions which have only looked at market access, economic interests. And then there are other regions that have looked at social, cultural, educational, protection and safety and maternity interests of women. So for example, when you look at European Union, they have some 45, 46 plus trade agreements. And the only way in which they have treated or envisaged the role of women in most of their agreements is by treating women in their role as mothers or social actors. Because most of the provisions you find in European Union are related to increasing women's access to education, decreasing violence based on sex, increasing women's access to skill development and equal pay for equal work, and childcare and maternity rights. When you move to Asia Pacific, the focus gets narrower, because for Asia Pacific trade agreements, women's role is only as mothers, right? So they talk about, with very few exceptions, most recent exceptions, are mothers, maternity health, safety, childcare, child nutrition. Then you move to North and South America, and it changes completely, because they talk about increasing women's businesses market access, women's access to fisheries, to agriculture, to investment, foreign investment, and so on and so forth. Increasing women's access to finance, which is such a huge barrier that women face. And productive resources such as land. In developing countries, including in African countries, more than 70 to 75% of farmers are women, but less than 1% of them actually own the land they farm on. That's inequality. And then when we go to Africa, we find different kinds of commitments. Now, in the trade agreements negotiated and signed in Africa, we find commitments where members seek to enhance women's business potential. Now, this focus is rare. We haven't seen this focus in a lot of other regions. They focus on integrating women in the region's development process. And that ties to a lot of other issues. And they also commit in binding obligations to increasing women's role as decision makers and policymakers in legislative assemblies and other institutions of the community, of the region. And that's again unique and very beneficial, because now we are talking about women as business leaders and decision makers and political representatives. And this is precisely what we are going to focus on in our study. Now, we are coming up with a study where so far we have heard a lot of criticism against trade and gender agenda. What is trade and gender? Gender mainstreaming in trade agreements don't work. Where's the evidence that it works? We are going to present an evidence with our study.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Amrita, and really looking forward to that study. And I think it was important for you to highlight, the fact that these provisions are drafted for the most part as best endeavor promises, and of course, the whole issue of enforcement and implementation. And that's where your study becomes incredibly important. And also very interesting, the different perspectives, the different approaches according to regions, Asia Pacific region with the focus on women as mothers. We move into Latin America. We look at increasing women's access to investment, finance, women's role in agriculture. And then, of course, on the continent, the focus on commitment to binding obligations, particularly in increasing women's role in development and in business and decision-making. But now, Anush, I'd also like to hear from you on the same question. Can you tell us a little bit more about what are gender provisions in regional trade agreements meant to achieve? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the implementation of gender provisions with trade policies and how this aims to increase women's leadership and decision-making roles. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadira. And I just want to actually complement what Amrita just said, looking at from the perspective of national trade policies. And actually, these provisions in regional trade agreements can definitely reinforce the effectiveness and the responsiveness of national trade policies, because obviously these provisions would be or could be translated into national trade policies. And so how could they really reinforce this effectiveness and this responsiveness of these policies? Well, first, because actually these provisions could be used by governments as a type of a type of checklist, for example, of potential measures or potential issues they could take or they could focus on when they develop their trade policy at the national level. And especially also because these provisions, as far as because they are negotiated within a regional framework or even a bilateral framework, they are really in line with their specific regional or national situations. So they are really targeted and they are really focused on specific needs of women in the region or in the country. A second point I would like to make about this reinforcement is that we see, as Amrita was saying, many of these gender issues that are integrated in these provisions are what I call indirect trade issues. That is to say, they are not directly linked to trade per se, but they have an impact on women in trade. And so when we talk about, for example, in some of these provisions, we see that they promote equal access to education, and we know that women are undereducated or uneducated, and without education, how can they go into trade activities? How can they work in the export sector, in the export-oriented sectors, and climb the ladder if they don't have education? So I think these type of kind of broader trade issues, if I may say so, also when they are translated in national trade policy, reinforce them, because they're not just focusing on the very narrow trade issue, but they go broadly, so that all the issues that have an impact on supporting women in trade could be also looked at and dealt with through trade policy. And that goes with the issue of leadership and access to decision-making bodies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anush, because I think those were incredibly important and rich insights that have we hear from your intervention, and just with the emphasis that's placed on gender responsive trade policies at the national levels, because of course, as Anush mentioned, many of these gender issues are indirect trade issues. They are not really specifically directly linked to trade, but they have an incredibly important impact on women, including the issue of access to education, access to skills development and training. So now moving on to our next question, and Amrita, I'd like to also hear again in the same sequence from you first and then from Anush. Do gender provisions in regional trade agreements really present an opportunity? I know you touched on this in part in your first intervention, but if you could elaborate and maybe drill a little deeper, do they really present an opportunity for increasing women's participation in politics and decision-making roles, specifically on the continent? And maybe as part of your intervention, could you please reflect briefly on the opportunities, really talk to us a little bit more about those opportunities presented in regional trade agreements. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadira. I think you made my job of answering a question tougher by using the word really. I could have easily answered it without the word really. But let me try and answer it in full. Do they really present an opportunity? Is probably a question for all of us to research upon, and it's a challenge that our community is now facing in terms of making these trade agreements, making these provisions, making these promises work in practice. How do we put them into action? Is the key question. But do they work, and are they meant to work? The answer is yes. Are they really working? The answer is yes and no. They are working in respect of some regions and some trade agreements, and they may not be working as they're supposed to work and as they are intended to work in these agreements for the other regions. When you look at East Africa in particular, and that is going to be the focus of our study in the paper that we are doing, we have found two trade agreements in particular that directly contain legal obligations. And we are looking at binding legal obligations this time. So I know I did say that a few minutes ago, all we have are best endeavor promises. But here we are now moving to a region that has incorporated, that has negotiated binding legal commitments, which are enforceable as well as legally binding. by their language and by their scope that directly comes under the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism. And these provisions are first found in COMESA, and eventually then they're found in the East African Community Agreement. So when you look at COMESA, the most interesting articles for this perspective to look at are Article 154 and 155, where members pledge to increase women's participation in decision-making and work on their laws and regulations to eliminate discrimination in this respect. And they don't use soft grammatical constructions and verbs such as may, could, can, that we normally find in other agreements whenever these agreements refer to women, right? The other very interesting mention that we find is in the East African Community. Here is an agreement that not only incorporates by reference COMESA, a very gender responsive trade agreement, into its text, but in addition to COMESA, parties in EAC go on to promising many other things. And there are two provisions which are directly related to enhancing women's role in decision-making and enhancing women's representation. It cannot get any more direct than this: enhancing women's representation in legislative institutions. I would like to draw your attention to Article 50, to be read with Article 121. Article 50 is where members seek to ensure gender balance in the appointment of staff for the composition of institutions for the community and in the election of members of the East African Legislative Assembly. Has that worked? Lolita is going to tell us about that. And that provision is to be read with Article 121, wherein members leave absolutely no doubt in their intention to foster women's role as leaders and decision makers, because Article 121 is a provision where members talk about enhancing women's role in socio-economic development at all levels, especially in decision making. So if you read these two legal provisions together, the intention is very clear. The intention of the agreement is very clear because there's a clear statement of commitment embedded in this agreement coming out from the East African region. And the commitment is to increase women's participation in political policy formulation, decision-making. Has that really worked? I'll probably invite my co-panelist Anush here, and then eventually Lalita to comment on that.
Okay, I think that's an excellent segue and pivot to you, Anush, but again, with emphasis on the qualify really. So is this really working? Thanks, Anush, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll do my best. Just actually, it's a very brief comment. It's more a comment than a real argument, I would say, because and kind of maybe going back to the principle of women's economic empowerment. What does it mean exactly? So and actually we can see that all these provisions we're talking about, all the gender-related provisions in trade agreements, aim at let's say building women's economic empowerment. And they do that by fostering many things like equal access to education, to healthcare, to finance, to employment and decent work, to enhance their skills, whether trade skills or digital skills, whether it's giving them a better market access or how to support women in benefiting from the opportunities created by trade. And so when we look at this aspect of women's economic empowerment, we see that actually it definitely reinforces women's position in society and in their communities. And through that, it's leading them towards access to decision-making bodies and to climb the leadership ladder. And so I think, going back to the principle of women's economic empowerment, once you have economic power, then it leads you to have it leads you towards a political power as well. And it can be happening at the national level. When women are empowered, then they have access to parliaments, for example, or governmental positions. But it can be also at the very would say more normal level. And I have this friend of mine, her name is Rosine, and she's a cocoa producer from Ivory Coast, and her story gives you exactly what tells you exactly what I was just explaining to you. She benefited from a capacity building program in agriculture, and actually many provisions in trade agreements aim at improving women's farming skills. And so through that, she was able to develop and expand her own cocoa crops and make a living out of it, and even export her products. And whereas before she was really economically dependent from her husband, she was saying, I have to go ask my husband for money so that I can buy food for the family or something like that. Now she's economically empowered. What this economic empowerment what was the impact of this economic empowerment for Rosine? Well, basically, she became a manager. She became a manager of business. She became a manager of people. And so these activities really steered Rosine into a leadership role. And so you can see the link between before she had not, she didn't have any economic independence. Once she got empowered economically, then she stepped into a role which is a more managerial role and a leadership role. So you can see that actually through these principles of women's economic empowerment leads beyond just the fact that providing women with an income. It goes really beyond that. It gives them a space and a voice in society.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anush. And I think that's so important, just unpacking and drilling deeper into what exactly is women's economic empowerment and the link between women's economic empowerment and political power, which of course is there, but we don't always reflect on. And of course, sharing Rosine's story with us, making it more personal, but also helping to illustrate the point that economically empowering women through trade provisions can really ensure that they become more politically empowered as well. And using the example of Rosine, who went from being economically dependent on her husband to economically independent, to exporting her crops and then becoming a manager. And I think that was an important story because Rosine is representative of millions across the continent whose stories are not shared on today's platform. So thank you very much for that, Anush. Lolita, now I go back to you and we go to the evidence that the WTO is working on. So explain to us now, what evidence do we have on the positive correlation between the implementation of gender provisions and the increase in women's participation in politics and decision-making roles in Africa?
So I will mostly focus on the provision that Amrita just discussed, or Article 9 and 50 of the EAC Treaty, which provides that members have to elect 9 people that will be seated at the EAC Legislative Assembly. Among these 9 people, it has to be gender balanced. This is a commitment. This is written like this. And when we have a look at the evidence, so I had a look at all the composition of the assembly. So I think it's something like they have like 7 years that they sit for 7 years. So there are since the entry into force of the treaty in 2001, there are 4 assemblies that were composed. And when we have a look at all these composition, the figures are very positive. First, the first assembly, so composed in 2001. Women represented 26% of the seats, so 1/4 at the first assembly. So it's not gender balanced, but it's definitely women are definitely represented at the assembly. The second assembly, 33%, so a third. The third, 50%, 40%. I'm sorry, 40%, and then the fourth, and this is the current assembly that is seated it's 41%. So there's an increase. But I also want to point out that if it's not gender balanced, so it's not 50%, definitely we can see that it's very close to the full implementation, as the provision 9 says that it has to be gender balanced, but the provision 50 says that the composition have to include members that will represent various opinions and groups of people, including gender. And when Rwanda joined the EAC, when it's right away elected 5 women, so more than 50%. And so I know that the figures are how could I say? It's lower than 50%, but depending of the country and depending of the assembly, sometimes it's higher than 50%, but most of the time it's like 4 women out of 9 people. So we're there. They have taken action to fully implement these 2 provisions. Also, regarding Article 121, which Amrita very well mentioned, that it provides for the participation of women in decision making. Well, we can see, and there's multiple studies saying that, or demonstrating that the participation of women in decision-making roles and leadership position has gradually increased since the entry into force of the EAC. But of course, there are multiple factors to this increase. It's not only these legal binding commitments, but in our studies, we will try to assess the extent to the contribution of these commitments and how it was reflected in the actions taken by members, by the parties to implement these 2 provisions. So to answer your question, there are evidence, they're quite positive. And with this gradual increase of the participation of women, or the representation of women at the EAC Legislative Assembly, we can see that the implementation of these 2 provisions are very quite well implemented, actually.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lolita, for sharing that important, encouraging, and really positive evidence emerging from the East African community in terms of the legislative and the representation of women at decision-making roles. Thank you very much for that. And also, Lolita, I want you just to expand a little bit more. So on that, on evidence, we know that the WTO is undertaking some phenomenal work in this regard, in this specific area. So if we're looking at assessing the contribution of gender provisions on gender equality and the participation of women in the economy, we also know that this presents a challenge. I mean, in so much as there are phenomenal opportunities, there are also risks and challenges. So could you expand a little bit more on what opportunities exist to address identified challenges, and link that to the work that the WTO is undertaking, and particularly if you could reflect a little bit more on the initiative. We hear a lot about it, and now that we have both Anush and yourself, we'd like you to expand a little bit more on the WTO database, and particularly on building the capacity of WTO members through information sharing and capacity building and training. It's an incredibly important initiative that we'd like to hear more about. Thanks.
So yes, indeed, it's a challenge to assess or to measure the participation of women in trade, or not only in trade, but in economic activities, or how the RTAs can increase their living standards. But this is something that we're working at the WTO, as Nadria very well mentioned. First, yesterday, we launched the WTO database on gender provisions in regional trade agreements. It's on the WTO website. I encourage you to have a look. You will find the articles that we are talking about today, so the provisions 9, 50, and 121 of the EAC. It's in the database. There's plenty of information to correctly understand them. So with this database, we were able to map all the provisions, and this shows that there's a few RTAs that provide for gender impact assessment. There's only 2 that provide with binding commitments to assess the impact of the agreements on women. The other are as part of cooperation efforts. But although it's as part of cooperation effort, it still provides an opportunity to collectively work to assess the impact of the agreements on women and to monitor the activities. So this database provides this opportunity. So this is something that we are working on. Second, through the informal working group on trade and gender that was created in 2020, it provides a venue for the 125, right? 125 members, part of the last name. So yes, it provides a venue for the 125 members that are part to this group to share their experience, their information, to build their capacity in this area. So to share information on how to collect gender desegregated data and gender impact assessment and monitoring activities. So again, this platform offers an opportunity to increase gender impact assessment. And lastly, so we created the Gender Research Hub last year to foster research initiative on trade and gender, to better understand the nexus between trade, gender equality, women's economic empowerment, and to increase the visibility of this work of research to further support members and by extension policymakers. So we offer this kind of how could I say, this kind of support to members to increase their activities or increase their efforts to have a better understanding of how the agreements affects women, but not only agreements, but how trade can impact positively women. So I will conclude with that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lolita, for sharing those important interventions and initiatives undertaken by the WTO. And I would encourage everybody to look more closely at the database, at the informal working group on trade and gender, of course, of the Gender Research Hub, as some of the initiatives that Lolita mentioned. And I'm mindful of the time, but Anush, I want to take advantage of the opportunity while you're here to just very briefly, the power of partnerships. And just that is so incredibly important, because we know that this massive agenda of women's economic empowerment and gender equality is not the responsibility and will not be accomplished by one stakeholder alone. So as part of the broader opportunities that Lolita alluded to, can you explain to us and can you unpack a little bit more for us about the supporting role that inclusive partnerships can play at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, and at the local level? Because it's really through this ecosystem of partnerships that we're going to be able to address and really attack this whole agenda of empowering women. Thanks.
So quite briefly, because yeah, the time is running. I think, if you look at that, I would say broadly at policy making, I think this requires a blended approach. And when I talk about the blended approach, I mean, like if it's like you're making a cocktail, actually, you're blending several flavors so that you have a tasty drink. While the policy making is kind of the same. You have to blend, for example, you have to look at the data. So you have to understand where women are in trade. If women entrepreneurs in your country are exporting or not, in which sector, where women are working. Are they working in companies that are export oriented or not? So all this data that often countries don't have. That's the first step of your cocktail making, if I may say so. Then you have the measures themselves. What kind of measures do you put into place once you know what are the needs of women and what you need to address through your policy? And actually, trade agreements can help. As I said, they can be used as a basis to look into what sort of measures can be included in trade policies. And then the third part is impact. So how do you assess impact? So we're here we're just here to talk about that aspect today, and in our upcoming paper about the impact of these measures. And then that creates a loop back to data collection, because once you understand your impact, you know what works, you know that what doesn't work, and then you probably would need some additional data or go deeper into your data collection so that you can really target better the sectors or the issues that don't work really, or were not really benefiting from the policies or the measures that governments have been taking. So in that blended approach, I would say you need to have, whenever you do data collection, when you adopt or you develop measures in trade policies, you need to be consulting. You need to be consulting your partners, and they can be multiple partners. And usually you have partners at the national level, and often what we see is that women are not included in those consultations. They are not often represented because women don't have access or don't really create these networks of influence that can go and talk to governments, whether they're at national level or even at local level. So that's an aspect. You need to understand, who are, what if networks are actually really established in the country. You need to know who they are and go to them and understand basically what are the needs of the women they represent. We see, for example, in South Asia that in the business sector, that women entrepreneurs are extremely well organized at the regional level, at the national level. So they have this pyramid organization where they have this regional organization at the top and the national levels that are members of the regional organization, and they do a lot of activities, and they are really included into these decision-making consultations. Actually, if you look, for example, in Africa, or even more in East Africa, we have a lot of these women entrepreneurs associations, but they are not organized that much. They don't talk to each other that much, and so if you are alone talking, if you are alone, of course, you have less power than if you regroup yourself into a coalition. And so we see that they have probably less power. And in the end, they are not part of the usual suspects that government would consult to make these policies and to have this, whether it's data collection or looking into measures, or looking into how these measures are impacting women. So that's one thing that is important, that government should know their counterparts, somehow, their stakeholders, and especially understand these organizations where women are represented and include them. So that's more at the national level or regional level. I would say at the international level, they are also. We see here, for example, in the WTO, as Lolita was saying, the informal working group on trade and gender. And this is where governments are exchanging and building their expertise in policy making and in integrating gender issues in policy making. And so through this, I would say, as part of this platform, they could also build partnerships themselves between countries. We definitely saw that we had some sessions, some discussions, for example, on data collection methods, and you have some countries that have developed really thorough methods to collect data, sex disaggregated data in trade, and they have been presenting these methods. And it was interesting to see that some other countries were interested because they were entering that sort of thinking and say, oh, how can we develop such a method? And so we could see that countries were talking to each other. Oh, can we have a meeting, and can we discuss with my other colleagues in the ministry, because they are starting to work on this, and what you presented could be also a good model for us. So they kind of I would call it like more a partnership at the more global level, in the sense that the global level is a platform for members to also learn from each other. So, and I will stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anush, for that comprehensive response. I'm not going to attempt to summarize because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. We're almost at the end of our session. So ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now yours. I'd like to open the floor for interventions. We'll start with our participants who are joining us here in Geneva today, and then move to interventions from our online participants. So colleagues, friends, the floor is yours. I see one hand there. I see another here, and I'll take maybe one more. Okay, very quickly. I'm just going to go 5 minutes over, and I'll hand over to the gentleman first, and then to you and to the lady at the back there. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for a very interesting session, and for the panelists also for the excellent overview they provide. I just have two questions. So perhaps my first question to Amrita and Lolita on the gender provisions in trade agreements. So to what extent, I mean, when based on your experience and especially on the data that you collected, what is the share more or less of the provisions that are legally enforceable and that might be subject to dispute settlement in order to guarantee that enforceability? Because based on, on other items, on environment, on services, for instance, it was very clear that the more enforceable and the more the provisions are subject to dispute settlement, the more likely they will be effective. So what's the share, roughly speaking, of those agreements, of those provisions? And my second question also, perhaps to all the panelists, to what extent the gender provisions in trade agreements, they address also the informal sector issue? Because we know that women in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they're working a lot in the informal sector. So the issue of informal sector is taken into consideration in such provisions or not? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to go very quickly. Our panelists need to leave to another meeting. So if you can keep your intervention to 30 seconds, and the same for the lady there, and then I will hand over to the panelists to address them. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Joy Tens from Africa Women in Trade. My question is actually for Amirata and as well Loretta, is when we're approaching to Africa, especially because these discussions about the Africa women who are going to business and in trade, how are we incorporating culture? When I mean culture, because I'm working with women on the ground and I've seen the culture, a man is still the leader in the house. And we have to respect this when we're approaching the women. So how are you incorporating in your research, in your assignment, and also working with also existing organizations? There's a lot of networks, as you have heard. How can you work with them because they have figured it out how to bring the women on board? Because culture is a big issue in the continent. I'm coming from Kenya, so I also know about the East African culture too. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question, and to the lady at the back. Thank you.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. The question is for all the panelists. Which has the biggest impact? Is it skills development, entrepreneurship, or is it trade provisions and FTAs? I'm mostly interested in seeing what really has the biggest impact vis-a-vis these trade agreements. You know, should we be putting a lot of effort into trade agreements, or should we be going directly towards skills or these other kind of barriers to women in trade? Thank you.
Excellent. And I just don't want to lose our participants online. And we have one question on when are we going to move towards including other genders in the gender chapters, or in any of these chapters? Do any chapters have provisions on LGBTQIA+? Thanks to our panelists, and particularly to our panelists who need to leave first. So I think that's Anusha and Lolita first. Go ahead.
Okay, very quickly, thank you very much for your questions. Regarding LGBTQ+, there's provisions about non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. I invite you to have a look at the database. You will have the information. You can look by, you can search by keywords. Second question regarding the informal sectors, they are like 2, 3, 4 top provisions that address specifically women in the informal sectors. There are other provisions about informal workers or informal traders, but regarding women, there's like maximum 2 to 4 provisions. But of course, you can have a look at the database and you will have the information about the dispute settlement mechanism. You also have this kind of information in the database. It says if it's explicitly excluded, if there's a specific procedures that is applicable, or but like the substance of the provisions, there's like less than 20 provisions out of more than 300 that are written with legal binding language. So very few.
Thanks, Anush. Over to you.
Maybe I'll answer the last question. Well, actually, it's interesting that you're mentioning, do we focus on provisions in trade agreements, or do we focus on capacity building? Well, actually, capacity building, so many provisions focus on building a capacity for women in trade, in agriculture, in fisheries. So this is quite, I would say, the norm that these provisions include this sort of provisions. But it's not just in trade agreements. We can see that also in national trade policies. Most of the national trade policies, if not all of the national trade policies, include either an element of capacity building in their different measures, or are only focusing on building capacity of women in trade. So, and especially women entrepreneurs and female farmers. Same thing we see when members are building aid for trade programs. Aid for trade programs more than often focus on building women entrepreneurs and female farmers' capacity to trade. So this is across I would say across the policy board. You can see that this issue of capacity building is really a key focus and a key issue included, whether in trade agreements, in trade policies at national level, or aid for trade programs.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Anush, Amrita, over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just really quickly touch upon 3 different questions here, respecting the time commitment of my colleagues here. So the last question about capacity building or trying to find a solution in trade agreements, as Anush rightly said, is, I think we're really looking at 2 different options, and the answer to your question, the short answer is both. I think they both need to work in complementarity. There are 2 different approaches to deal with the problem and find solutions to gender inequality, top down and bottom up. So bottom up is absolutely crucial, but in various countries, we are not able to move bottom up ahead. And just to trigger and incentivize changes at the bottom, at the domestic level, we are trying to use the international instruments to sort of mobilize changes at the domestic level. So this is a top-down approach that we're trying to explore, but both are absolutely complementary and important. Touching upon the culture question, thank you so much. It's a brilliant question, and this is something that we need to address in the paper. I think it goes to the very core, to the very heart of what is it that we are trying to address. We are trying to address gender equality, but how do we conceptualize gender equality? I think we need to conceptualize and provide a meaning to the fundamental term of gender equality in light of the culture and the domestic conditions we are dealing with. And accordingly, that conceptualization as per the region is absolutely fundamental. And finally, to my colleague here, the chair from Egypt, thank you for this question. Informal sector. Lolita did mention that there are a couple of provisions. However, there are very few. So we're looking at some 4 or 5 provisions on informal sector for women out of 300 plus trade provisions that directly talk about gender or women equality. So they're very minimal. And the key problem right now, and you've actually touched the core of the problem here. The key problem right now is we have all these promises, we have all these provisions on increasing women's access to market access, on reserving a portion of government procurement market access for women's businesses. But are they able to access it? Because 80% of the women businesses are in the informal informal nature. If their businesses are informal, do they have the right papers and qualifications and eligibility requirements to apply for the funding that is being provided through these trade agreements, or enhanced market access, or reservations or waivers that are supplier diversity programs? Can they access them? The answer is unfortunately no, because they are not being catered to informal. And the same happened for COVID-19 relief programs. COVID-19 relief programs were offered by various countries in developing and developed countries and least developed countries across the world. And some of them were catered for women's businesses to provide them the relief to grow and come back on the market during the pandemic. However, most of them could not access it because they had the requirements of formalized businesses, and therefore the informal businesses could not. So this is a very pertinent issue that we need to deal with and answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amrita. I'm now going to hand over to Anush for a concluding response on the questions. Anush, over to you.
So maybe not on the questions, but a concluding note. And we're in the WTO here, 164 members, and we're talking about female African leadership. And if we look at the figures actually of leadership in the WTO, they're quite interesting. Actually, in the WTO, 31% of the African members are represented at ambassador level in the organization by women. And it's quite above the overall WTO membership rate, which is of 22%. And these are the figures from this year. So I think that's quite compelling to say that, you know, African countries are really engaged into giving women access to leadership positions and decision-making bodies, whether it's through trade agreements or even here at the WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, to our online participants and to you who have joined us today, we have now concluded today's important discussion on an impact assessment of gender provisions in FTAs, an empirical look at the African experience. Thank you very much. I'm sure you will all agree that it's been an incredibly energized and invigorating session, but that there's so much more to be said on this important subject. So on that, I will encourage you to continue to stay engaged, both with us and both with those important stakeholders that we spoke to at the national level, at the regional level, the continental level, and of course here in Geneva at the global level, including through the work that the WTO is undertaking on this important subject. Yes, thank you for your attendance at early in the morning Geneva time at 9:30.